Welcome to Old Lantern Tales, where every story holds a secret, shadows, mysteries, and whispers from the past, all waiting for you. Let's begin.
Chapter 1. The Discovery. Date: October 14th, 1893, 9:40 p.m. Aboard a northbound luxury train, somewhere between Vienna and Prague. No one remembered hearing the trunk arrive, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, because in a narrow train corridor where every footstep echoed and every door announced itself, something that large, something that heavy, should not have appeared without a single soul noticing. And yet there it was, pressed quietly against the polished wooden wall as though it had always belonged there, and the only reason anyone looked at it at all was because of the blood, not spilled, not splattered, but creeping, a thin, deliberate line slipping from beneath its base and stretching slowly across the floor, dark and controlled, as if guided rather than flowing, and for several long seconds no one screamed, no one moved, because the mind refuses to accept what it cannot explain, until at last someone did scream, sharp, sudden, and cut brutally short, as if even that sound had been taken away before it could fully exist. And then came the silence, heavy and unnatural, settling over the corridor like something alive, watching, waiting. And by the time Sherlock Holmes stepped out from his compartment, the atmosphere had already shifted into something colder, something wrong. Passengers drawn back in a loose circle around the trunk, their faces pale, their voices reduced to fractured whispers that never quite formed complete sentences. And Holmes did not rush, because he never rushed. Not when something wanted to be understood, his eyes taking in everything at once. The exact angle of the trunk, the untouched dust lining its edges, the distance of the blood's slow advance, the way it did not spread chaotically but followed a path almost intentional, and beside him Hastings exhaled quietly, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "Holmes, that cannot be." "It is," Holmes replied, not looking at him, his gaze fixed on the thin, dark line that continued to lengthen, another drop forming, hanging for just a moment too long before falling, as if timed, as if released, and that detail, small as it was, tightened something unseen in the air, because blood does not hesitate, it does not choose when to fall, and yet this did. A uniformed officer stepping forward with visible discomfort, explaining too quickly, "It was loaded at the last station, sir. I oversaw it myself. No one has approached it since." And Holmes's eyes shifted briefly to the lock. Pristine, untouched, no sign of tampering, no scratches, no pressure marks, nothing to suggest it had been opened or needed to be. And that was when a woman's voice trembled from the back, barely audible. There was no sound, not before this, nothing at all. And that absence settled deeper than any scream could have, because silence like that does not accompany violence. It contradicts it. And Holmes crouched slowly beside the trunk, not touching it, never rushing contact, his attention narrowing to the narrow gap beneath where darkness met the floor, and that unnatural red continued to emerge, steady, patient, controlled. "Hastings," he said quietly, "if a man were dying inside this trunk, what would you expect?" Hastings swallowed hard. "Movement, struggle, something, anything." "Yes," Holmes murmured, "anything." But there was nothing, not a shift, not a breath, not even the faintest disturbance within. Only the slow, measured drip that now seemed far too loud for something so small, echoing down the corridor like a ticking clock no one could see. "Open it!" someone demanded from behind, the tension finally cracking, but the officer hesitated. if there is a victim, or, Holmes interrupted as he rose to his feet, his tone calm in a way that felt almost misplaced, there is no victim at all. And that sentence did not ease the fear. It sharpened it, twisted it into something worse, because now the question was no longer who was inside, but whether anything human was at all. The train giving a sudden, subtle lurch as it curved along the tracks, the overhead lights flickering just once. And in that single blink of dimness, a man standing closest to the trunk stumbled backward violently, his face draining of color. "It moved," he whispered, and no one answered him, not because they hadn't heard, but because acknowledging it would make it real. Hastings stepping closer to Holmes, his voice barely controlled. "You saw that, didn't you?" But Holmes did not respond, instead leaning in closer than before until his ear hovered just inches from the cold surface of the trunk, listening, truly listening, the entire corridor holding its breath along with him, waiting for the smallest confirmation, a scratch, a shift, a heartbeat. But what came instead was nothing, and somehow that nothing was heavier than any sound could have been. And when Holmes straightened again, his expression had changed, not into fear, but into something far more unsettling. Recognition, his eyes no longer fixed on the trunk, but slowly moving across the faces gathered around it, one by one, measuring, calculating, as though the answer had shifted, as though whatever this was had never been confined to wood and iron. "Hastings," he said softly, "consider this." And Hastings forced himself to meet its gaze. "Yes?" "If a man were bleeding to death inside that trunk," Holmes began, his voice lowering, each word deliberate, "why does the blood fall as though it is being released and not escaping?" Another drop fell, perfectly timed, and more importantly, he added, his eyes flicking briefly toward the lock, still untouched, who decided when it should begin? No one spoke. No one moved, because in that moment the question was no longer about what was inside, but who had already touched it. And then, just as the silence stretched to its breaking point, the trunk gave a slow, deliberate creak, not sudden, not accidental, but controlled, like something adjusting its weight from within, and this time no one dared deny it, because whatever had been inside that trunk had not been still the entire time, only waiting for them to notice. Chapter 2. The Impossible Crime. Date: October 14th, 1893, 9:52 p.m. Same train. Corridor outside. Compartment 3. The trunk did not open immediately, and that hesitation was the first sign that something had already gone wrong, because moments earlier it had moved, subtly, deliberately, enough to shake the certainty of everyone watching. And now, as the officer gave a sharp, almost impatient nod, the porter stepped forward and struck the lock with more force than necessary, once, then again, the crack of metal splitting through the corridor like a gunshot, followed by a silence so complete it felt forced, as though even the train itself had paused to listen. And when the lid finally began to rise, it did not spring open but lifted slowly, unevenly, as if resisting the hands that pulled it, as though whatever had been inside had not entirely released its hold. And Hastings leaned forward, despite the tightening in his chest, bracing himself for the confirmation of horror, the smell of blood, the sight of a body, something terrible but explainable. But when the lid reached its peak and remained there, unmoving, the expectation shattered quietly, almost gently, because there was nothing inside, nothing at all, no body, No blood, no disturbance, not even the faintest mark to suggest that anything had ever occupied that space. The interior clean to the point of impossibility, dry, untouched, wrong, in a way that no amount of logic could immediately repair. And behind him, a woman's voice broke into a whisper that trembled on the edge of panic. But we saw it, and no one corrected her, because they had. All of them had. The blood still continuing its slow, deliberate path across the floor outside, thick and dark and undeniably real, refusing to match the emptiness before them. The officer dropping to one knee, running his gloved hand across the interior with growing urgency, pressing into the corners, testing the base, searching for some hidden mechanism, some explanation that would restore order. No compartment, no seams, nothing, he muttered. But his voice lacked conviction, because what he was saying did not align with what he was seeing, and Hastings turned sharply to Holmes, frustration cutting through his unease. "Explain this." But Holmes did not respond, not yet, because he had already stepped closer than anyone else dared, his attention fixed not on the obvious absence, but on the subtle contradictions, his hand reaching forward, touching the inside only once, lightly, as though testing not the surface, but the memory of what had been there, and for the briefest moment, so brief most would have missed it. His fingers paused, and that pause was enough to change everything. "Holmes!" Hastings pressed again, more urgently now, and Holmes withdrew his hand slowly, looking at it as if confirming something unseen before speaking in a voice far quieter than the situation demanded. "It's warm." And that single word spread through the corridor faster than fear itself, because warmth meant presence, meant something had been there not minutes ago, but seconds. And suddenly the emptiness no longer felt empty. It felt recent, like a space that had only just been vacated, and a man near the far end spoke up abruptly, his voice strained, as though he had been fighting the words until they forced their way out. "I saw him." And every head turned, the man swallowing hard under the weight of their attention. "At Vienna. The lid wasn't fully closed. I looked inside." "And?" Hastings demanded, his voice sharper than before, and the man hesitated just long enough to make it worse. "There was a man, a hand. I saw his hand." And that image settled into the silence like something physical, something that refused to leave, Hastings glancing back at the trunk as if expecting it to correct itself, to make sense again. "Then where is he now?" he asked. But the question sounded weaker than it should have, because he already knew there was no answer that would feel safe. And Holmes rose slowly, deliberately, and for the first time since the discovery, he stopped looking at the trunk entirely, his attention shifting instead to the people surrounding it, his gaze moving across them one by one, not hurried, not uncertain, but precise, measuring reactions, noting breaths, watching for something that did not belong. "No one has left this train," he said quietly, "and no one has entered it." And the pause that followed was long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough for the implication to take shape on its own. "Which means," he continued, letting the words hang just out of reach, forcing them to complete the thought themselves, and when they did, it showed, in the subtle widening of eyes, in the slight retreat of bodies, in the way people instinctively created space between one another, because the danger had shifted. It was no longer contained, no longer distant. The man who was inside that trunk, Holmes said softly, did not vanish. Hastings felt it then, not as logic, but as something colder, something instinctive. He stepped out, Holmes finished, his voice steady, and the finality of it landed harder than any shout could have. And he is still here. And that was when the corridor changed completely, because now every glance carried suspicion, every movement felt observed, every breath slightly too loud, the passengers no longer standing together, but apart, as though distance alone could offer protection. And then it came, a sound, soft but unmistakable, a single footstep from the far end of the corridor, deliberate, controlled, and every head turned at once toward the dim stretch of passage disappearing into shadow. But there was nothing there, no figure, no movement, only emptiness. And yet Holmes did not relax, his expression tightening instead, because something about it was wrong, something subtle but undeniable. "Did you hear that?" Hastings whispered. But Holmes did not answer immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as the realization settled in, because the sound had not echoed, not along the wood, not through the walls, not in the confined space where every noise should have carried. It had been too close for that, too contained, and that meant only one thing, that whoever had made that step had not moved away at all. They had simply stopped, somewhere within the corridor itself, hidden not by distance, but by presence, close enough to hear them breathe, close enough to hear them think. And as that understanding spread silently between them, a far more disturbing question began to take shape. If the man had truly stepped out of the trunk, then why had no one seen him leave? And more importantly, who had he been standing next to when he did? Chapter 3. The Man Still on the Train. Date: October 14th, 1893 is 10:11 p.m., moving through the Carpathian night. "He's not gone," Holmes said, and this time it did not sound like deduction, it sounded like recognition, and that difference settled uneasily over the corridor, because moments earlier every person present had begun to look at one another not as strangers, but as possibilities, the lingering question from before still hanging unspoken between them. Who had been standing next to him? And before anyone could give voice to that thought, Holmes moved, not toward the trunk, but past it, as though the answer had already shifted, his eyes following something subtle, something easily dismissed if one did not know what to look for. A thin, uneven streak tracing across the polished floor, darker in some places, nearly invisible in others, slipping away from the trunk like a path deliberately broken. "Holmes?" Hastings murmured, quickening his pace to follow. "That wasn't there before." "It was," Holmes replied without slowing. "You simply were not meant to notice it until now." And there was something in that statement that felt less like observation and more like intent, as though the trail itself had been revealed rather than discovered, its pattern inconsistent in a way that suggested control rather than accident. Thicker where the path turned, thinner where it straightened, as though whoever left it had been aware of being followed, or expected to be, and when they reached the junction between the first-class carriage and the servants' quarters, the line ended abruptly, not fading, not trailing off, but stopping cleanly, deliberately. "It ends here," Hastings said, crouching instinctively, but Holmes shook his head slightly. "No, it disappears here." And his hand moved along the brass paneling, slow, precise, searching not for what was visible, but for what had been disturbed, until his fingers paused at a faint scratch, thin, fresh, almost invisible, unless one knew exactly where to look. Metal, "Forced in haste," he murmured, and before Hastings could question him, Holmes pressed inward, and a dull, reluctant click answered, the wall shifting just enough to reveal a narrow gap, dark and unnatural, a space that did not belong within the clean geometry of the train, something hidden not by accident, but by design. And the reaction behind them was immediate. Gasps, a step backward, a hesitation none of them could fully explain. But Holmes did not hesitate. Stepping into the confined passage as though he had expected it, Hastings following with far less certainty, the space closing around them almost instantly, pipes lining the walls, iron pressing too close, the air not stale, but disturbed, recently used, carrying the faint warmth of breath that should not have lingered, and that was when Hastings saw it. A white glove, caught against a jagged bolt, torn at the fingertips, stained dark where blood had soaked through and begun to dry. "Good God!" he whispered, but Holmes removed it with care, studying it with an expression that did not match the discovery. "This is too convenient," he said quietly, and that statement carried more weight than the glove itself, because convenience implied intention, implied staging. "What do you mean?" Hastings asked, but before Holmes could answer, a scream tore through the train. Not distant, not muffled, but immediate, sharp, and filled with something far worse than fear, recognition, and they moved instantly out of the passage, through the corridor, into the dining carriage where the atmosphere had shifted again. Passengers pressed tightly against the walls, as if avoiding the center of the room, where a young woman stood trembling, her hand shaking as she pointed toward an empty chair. "He was there," she gasped. "He was sitting right there." And the chair was indeed empty, but the table was not. Holmes, approaching slowly, his attention drawn not to absence, but to what had been left behind, a single wine glass untouched, and beside it, pressed into the white cloth, a fingerprint, dark red, still fresh, still wet enough to catch the light. Hastings swallowing hard. Did anyone else see him? And a man nearby nodded weakly. "Yes, but what?" Holmes asked, and the hesitation that followed felt wrong in a way that was difficult to define. "I cannot remember his face," the man said finally, his voice tightening. "Not blurred, not hidden, just gone." And that was not confusion. That was absence, something removed rather than forgotten. Holmes's eyes narrowing slightly at that detail, because it was not natural, not possible, and yet it had happened. His attention shifting briefly to the window, slightly open, cold air drifting inward. "He wants to be seen," Holmes murmured, and Hastings shook his head instinctively. "No, he wants something else." "Yes," Holmes agreed quietly, "he does." And then his focus shifted to a man standing at the edge of the group, older, composed in appearance but not in control, his stillness too rigid, his eyes too fixed, not on the chaos, but on the glove still held in Holmes's hand. "Sir," Holmes said, stepping closer, raising it slightly, "have you seen this before?" And the reaction came too quickly, too sharply. The man froze, his gaze locking on to the blood-stained fabric before he answered, "No." But the word came a second too late, and Holmes noticed, he always noticed, but before he could press further, the lights went out, completely, without flicker or warning, plunging the carriage into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. And in that darkness, something moved, not distant, not rushing, but close, so close that Hastings felt it before he understood it, the faint displacement of air as something or someone passed beside him, near enough that he could have reached out and touched it. Holmes. "Do not move," Holmes said immediately, his voice lower now, controlled, but altered. "He is here." And the seconds that followed stretched unnaturally, long enough for the mind to begin imagining what stood unseen within arm's reach, long enough to feel the weight of presence without proof, until the lights returned abruptly, breaking the tension but not removing it. Gasps filling the room as vision returned, and immediately Hastings turned, searching for the man Holmes had addressed, but the space where he had stood was empty, the nearby door swaying gently as though recently used, and on the table beside it, a folded note, its edges stained faintly. Holmes, picking it up, reading it once, then again, and for the first time since this began, something in his expression tightened. "What does it say?" Hastings asked, and Holmes handed it to him without answering. 3 words written unevenly across the page, not shaky, but deliberate, as though the hand that wrote them remembered trembling rather than felt it. 1878 was not forgotten, and the meaning settled heavily, because this was no longer about disappearance, no longer about escape. This was about return. Holmes turning slowly toward the dark corridor ahead, his voice quieter now, but carrying something far heavier than before. "This was never about the trunk," he said, pausing just long enough for the thought to form, before finishing in a tone that left no room for comfort. "It was about who was meant to be inside it, and who refused to stay there." Chapter 4. The Man Who Should Have Been Dead. Date: October 14th, 1893, 10:36 p.m. Dining car to rear compartments. "Move," Holmes said, but this time the urgency in his voice carried something new, not just pursuit, but recognition, as though the pieces had already begun aligning in a way he did not yet fully trust. And Hastings, still holding the note that had changed everything, followed without question. The words 1878 was not forgotten, lingering in his mind not as a message, but as a warning, because whatever had stepped out of that trunk had not simply escaped, it had returned, and that distinction settled uneasily as Holmes pushed forward through the corridor, faster now, his pace no longer measured but deliberate, cutting through the thinning crowd of passengers who instinctively moved aside without understanding why. Holmes, 1878. "What does it mean?" Hastings called after him, his voice struggling to keep pace with his thoughts. "It means," Holmes replied without turning, "that whatever we are dealing with was meant to stay buried." And that word, buried, carried weight now, because it implied something far worse than death, something deliberate, something chosen. And when they reached the junction, Holmes stopped so abruptly that Hastings nearly collided with him, his gaze fixed on the brass panel, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because it was no longer closed, no longer hidden, but open, slightly ajar, as though left that way not in haste, but with intent, and the realization came quietly, almost gently. It had not been discovered, it had been used, it was opened, Hastings said, though the words felt unnecessary, from the inside. Holmes finished, and this time he did not move immediately, because for the first time since this began, he hesitated, and that hesitation spoke louder than any conclusion, because if the passage had been used, then whatever had used it had not been ahead of them. It had been among them, and perhaps still was. "He is not running," Holmes said quietly, more to himself than to Hastings. "He is moving where he wishes." And that thought shifted the danger entirely, because it meant control, it meant awareness. And then Holmes stepped forward into the passage once more, the confined space feeling different now, tighter, closer, as though it resisted their presence, the air disturbed in a way that suggested recent movement. Not minutes ago, but seconds. And that was when Hastings saw it, a shape at the far end, slumped, unnatural in its stillness, and instinct told him what it was before his mind allowed it. "Holmes," he said quietly, and together they approached, the lantern light shaking slightly in Hastings' grip as it revealed the old man from the dining carriage. His body collapsed against the metal wall, his posture wrong in a way that suggested not rest, but interruption. His eyes half open, frozen in an expression that was not pain, but something far more unsettling, recognition. "He's dead," Hastings said, though the certainty in his voice was thinner than it should have been, and Holmes crouched beside the body. His movement slower now, more deliberate, as though he already expected contradiction, his fingers brushing the man's wrist, then his throat, pausing longer than necessary, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. No, not dead, but this time there was no confidence in the statement, only observation, because the man's skin was cold, not gradually, not naturally, but completely, as though warmth had been taken rather than lost. And that distinction lingered uncomfortably as Holmes adjusted the man's collar, revealing a locket that slipped free with a soft metallic sound, old, worn, handled many times before, and when he opened it, the image inside drew both their attention instantly. 3 men, younger, closer, bound by something unspoken, Hastings pointing almost immediately. "That's him." But Holmes's focus had already shifted to the third figure, and in that moment something in his expression changed, not shock, but confirmation. "Yes," he said quietly, "the same face described at Vienna, the same man who had been seen inside the trunk." And before either of them could process the implication, the body beneath them convulsed violently, air forcing its way back into lungs that should not have held it, the man's eyes snapping open wide with terror, so immediate it felt contagious, his hand gripping Holmes with desperate strength. "He's here!" he choked, his voice fractured. I saw him standing." "Who?" Holmes demanded, sharper now, and the man's lips trembled, not from present fear, but from remembered horror. "We buried him," he whispered. "We buried him and left him." His voice breaking under the weight of it, Holmes leaning closer, his tone cutting through the panic. "Who?" And this time the answer came slower, as though speaking. It carried consequence. "Edgar. Voss." The name settling into the space like something that had been waiting to be said again, something that did not belong to the present. 1878, the man continued, his breath uneven. "Blackridge Tunnel. Collapse. We sealed it." His grip tightening painfully around Holmes's sleeve, with him inside. And the silence that followed was not confusion, it was understanding, because now the story had shape, had guilt, had intent, and Hastings felt it shift from mystery into something far heavier. "He cannot be alive," he said quietly, but Holmes did not dismiss it, did not correct it, and that silence was more unsettling than agreement. "Where?" Holmes asked instead, and the man's eyes dropped instinctively, as though even remembering the place carried weight. "Blackridge Tunnel." And at that exact moment the train jolted violently, stronger than before, the impact rattling through the metal structure, the lamps flickering once, twice, before steadying again. But something else had changed, something deeper, because beneath the sound of the wheels, beneath the movement of the train, there was another sound, low, deliberate and wrong, not mechanical, not rhythmic, but controlled, like weight shifting through the walls themselves, Hastings feeling it beneath his feet, not vibration, but presence. Something moving with intention inside the structure of the train, Holmes rising immediately, stepping toward the narrow window and wiping away the condensation in a single motion, revealing the darkness beyond. Endless, suffocating except for one shape in the distance, barely visible through the fog. An archway, broken, waiting. "Holmes?" Hastings said, but Holmes did not look away, his voice lowering as the realization settled fully into place. "We are not approaching it," he said, a pause stretching just long enough to become unsettling. "It has been waiting for us." And behind them, the sound came again, closer now, no longer distant, no longer hidden, but directly beside them, within the walls, the man on the floor beginning to shake uncontrollably, his voice breaking into a whisper of pure terror. "No, he died there. We left him there." Another slow step echoed through the metal, closer, deliberate, certain, until it stopped just outside the panel, silence falling so completely it felt suffocating. And Holmes's voice, when he spoke again, was colder than anything Hastings had heard before. "Then tell me," he said quietly, "if he died in that tunnel?" And for a moment nothing answered, no movement, no sound, until something shifted faintly within the wall itself, not walking, but adjusting, as though listening, and Holmes finished, softer now but far more dangerous. "Who has been following us since we left it?" Chapter 5. The Tunnel of Return. Date: October 14th, 1893, 10:58 p.m., approaching Blackridge Tunnel. The train did not slow as it approached the tunnel, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, because moments earlier something had been moving within its walls, something that had stopped just long enough to listen, and now, as the black arch of Blackridge Tunnel emerged through the fog ahead, the engine hesitated, not in speed, but in intent, a subtle resistance that lasted only a second before it continued forward, as though whatever lay ahead had not allowed it to stop. And Holmes stood at the window unnaturally still, his reflection barely visible against the darkness beyond. "Hastings," he said quietly, "observe the track." And Hastings, already uneasy, forced himself to look, his breath catching as the rails seemed to blur, not vanish, but misalign, as though the train was no longer bound to them in the way it should have been. "That's not possible," he said under his breath. "No," Holmes agreed calmly, "it is not." And yet the train continued, steady, committed, drawn forward into something that no longer obeyed the ordinary rules of motion, and behind them the old man's voice broke again, weaker now, unraveling under the weight of what was coming. "We should not be here, not again." And Holmes turned, his gaze sharper now. "Then say it," he said, not unkindly, but without patience. "Say all of it." And for a moment the man resisted, but the tunnel ahead seemed to pull the truth out of him. "We left him," he whispered, his voice cracking, "alive." And the word hung in the air longer than it should have, because it changed everything that had come before. We told them it was empty, but he was trapped, buried beneath the collapse, calling for help, his breathing becoming uneven, for 2 days. And that detail did not pass. It lingered, heavy, because 2 days was not survival. It was transformation. "We sealed it," he finished, his voice breaking entirely. "We sealed him inside." And at that exact moment the train crossed into the tunnel, and the world disappeared, not dimmed, but erased, the darkness immediate and absolute, swallowing even the sense of space itself. Hastings instinctively reaching out before stopping mid-motion, because something had already moved beside him, close enough that the air shifted against his skin. "Holmes," he whispered, and Holmes's voice came low and controlled. "Do not move," because the tunnel was not silent. It carried something deeper, a slow, uneven rhythm that did not belong to the train, but to the walls themselves, as though the structure remembered something moving within it, breathing, waiting, and then came the sound, metal scraping, close, too close, not ahead, not behind, but inside the carriage itself. "Mr. Voss," Holmes said into the darkness, his tone steady, certain, and for a moment nothing answered long enough for doubt to form, until a voice emerged, not from a direction, but from the space itself, low, fractured, and disturbingly calm. "I remember that name," and Hastings felt something cold tighten in his chest, because memory meant survival, and survival meant something had changed. "You should not," Holmes replied. "A man buried for 15 years does not remember. He fades." And there was a shift in the darkness, subtle, but closer now. "He does," the voice answered, "if he never stopped being there." And for a brief instant, something took shape. Not fully visible, but enough to register as wrong, too still, too tall, proportions that did not align with the human form, as though the darkness itself had learned to imitate one imperfectly, and Holmes stepped forward, not away, but toward it. "You were not buried where they believed," he said, his voice cutting through the space. "You found the tunnels within the tunnel, the maintenance passages, the hollow spaces. They sealed the entrance, not the structure." And the breathing stopped completely, as though something was listening more closely now. "You survived," Holmes continued, "not by waiting, but by moving." And something in the darkness reacted, not violently, but knowingly. "You watched them," Holmes said. "You followed them, and tonight you brought them back." And for the briefest moment the shape became clearer. A face, or something attempting one, stretched unnaturally. Features suggested but never fixed, as though memory had replaced identity. "They closed it," the voice said, quieter now. "They left me in the dark." "And so you returned them to it," Holmes replied, and the answer came without hesitation. "Yes." And behind them the old man broke completely, his voice rising in panic. "I didn't mean—" But he never finished, because something moved, fast, precise, and final, a sudden shift of air, a body collapsing, then nothing, no struggle, no resistance, just absence. And when the lights flickered back for a single fleeting second, the man was gone, completely, as though he had never occupied that space at all, and in his place something else had returned, something that had not been there moments before. The trunk, positioned once again at the center of the carriage, closed, locked, exactly as it had been at the beginning. Hastings staring at it in disbelief. "That's not possible." But Holmes did not respond immediately, because his attention had already fixed on the base of the trunk, where a thin line of blood began to emerge once more, slow, controlled, deliberate, as if restarting a process that had never truly ended, and Holmes stepped closer, stopping just short, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "It was never about escape," he said, and Hastings turned toward him, unsettled. "Then what was it?" And Holmes's gaze did not shift from the trunk as another drop fell, perfectly timed. "Continuation," he said, and in the faint reflection of that dark spreading line, something inside the trunk shifted, not violently, not desperately, but subtly, as if settling into place, as if accepting something that had been denied before, and Hastings felt it then, not understanding, but certainty, that whatever had once been inside had not returned. Something else had taken its place, something that now belonged there. And Holmes, still watching, added one final thought, softer than anything he had said before, but far more unsettling. The tunnel was never his prison, Hastings. A pause, stretching just long enough to become unbearable before he finished. It was where he learned how to come back, and from within the trunk, just once, something tapped lightly against the inside of the lid, not in panic, not in escape, but in acknowledgment, as though whatever now rested within knew it would be opened again.
Thank you for visiting Old Lantern Tales. The stories don't end here. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a secret from the shadows. Until next time, keep your lanterns burning.